Jason Cooper had just done something millions of people dream about their entire lives. He had married the woman he loved. The church was full, the flowers were perfect, the music played just the way they had rehearsed. His mother was crying in the front row. His father clapped him on the back and told him he had never looked more like a man. And when Sasha walked down that aisle in her white dress, with her hair pinned up the way he loved it, Jason felt something he had only ever felt once before in his life. The feeling that everything, for once, was exactly where it was supposed to be. He had spent years working toward this moment, years of patience, years of faith.
He believed with everything in him that Sasha was the one. And he believed that the man standing beside him at the altar, his best friend Derek, was the kind of person who would never, ever betray him. He was wrong about both of them. And before that wedding night was over, Jason would open a door in a quiet hotel hallway that would take him years to recover from. Because what he found on the other side of that door wasn't just betrayal. It was the kind of betrayal that makes you question everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and the people you choose to trust.
Before we begin, let me know in the comment where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and your support helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.
Jason Cooper grew up in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio. He was the second of 3 brothers, raised in a house where his father worked long shifts at a manufacturing plant, and his mother kept the family together with nothing but discipline, love, and strong coffee. From the time he was a teenager, Jason was the kind of person people described as steady. Not flashy, not loud, just steady. He showed up when he said he would. He worked without complaining. He kept his word even when it cost him something. His brothers used to tease him about it, saying he was too serious, that he needed to loosen up. But Jason always believed that the way you treated people in the small moments said everything about who you were in the big ones. He went to a state university on a partial scholarship and studied business administration. He wasn't the top student in his class, but he graduated on time, landed a job at a mid-sized logistics company in Columbus, and within 5 years had worked his way up to a regional coordinator position. He wasn't rich, but he was building something. He had a small apartment that he kept clean. He drove a practical car. He saved a portion of every paycheck. He lived the way his father had taught him, quietly, consistently, without fanfare. And those who knew him well would tell you there was a dignity in that, a quiet kind of strength that most people don't notice until they need it. Jason was not the kind of man who walked into a room and commanded attention. But he was the kind of man who, once you had his loyalty, you never wanted to lose it. He met Sasha Bennett at a mutual friend's birthday party when he was 28. She was wearing a yellow dress and laughing at something across the room, and Jason, who was not normally the type to approach a stranger, found himself walking over before he had even thought about what he would say. They talked for 3 hours that night. She was funny and sharp and had opinions about everything: movies, politics, food, the way people drove on highways. Jason had never felt so immediately comfortable with someone he had just met. He drove home that night, replaying the conversation in his head. He texted their mutual friend before he had even pulled into his parking lot to ask for Sasha's number. Their first year together was everything Jason had ever quietly hoped a relationship could be. They went on weekend drives to nowhere in particular. They cooked dinner together on Friday nights and argued happily about what movie to watch. Sasha was creative and spontaneous in ways that balanced Jason's methodical nature. She worked as a graphic designer at a small agency downtown, and she was good at it, genuinely talented in ways that Jason admired without fully understanding. Their friends loved them together. People would often say they made it look easy, and for a long time, it was. But looking back, and Jason would do a great deal of looking back in the months that followed, there were signs he chose not to see. Small things that on their own meant nothing, but together, in hindsight, told a story he hadn't been willing to read. There were the times Sasha would leave a room to take a phone call. She always had an explanation. It was a client, it was her sister, it was her boss. And Jason believed her, because why wouldn't he? There were the weekends she was tired and distant, pulling away when he tried to get close. He put it down to work stress. There was the night he borrowed her phone to look up directions and noticed a name in her recent contacts he didn't recognize. When he asked, she laughed it off so easily that he felt embarrassed for asking. He was not a suspicious man by nature, and he had never been given a reason to be, at least not one he had allowed himself to acknowledge. Derek Lawson had been Jason's closest friend since college. They had met during freshman orientation and immediately bonded over a shared sense of humor and a mutual hatred of early morning classes. Derek was the kind of friend who made every situation feel more fun. He was outgoing where Jason was reserved, charming where Jason was practical. Over the years, Derek had been there for every major moment in Jason's life. The job promotions, the tough conversations, the nights when Jason just needed someone to sit with him and not ask too many questions. When Jason and Sasha started getting serious, Derek was one of the first people Jason told, and Derek had seemed genuinely happy for them. He welcomed Sasha into their friend group. He praised her to Jason. He called Jason lucky and meant it, or at least that's what Jason believed. When Jason proposed to Sasha on a quiet evening at the park where they had gone on their second date, she cried. He cried a little too, though he would never fully admit it. He called Derek from the parking lot that night, still holding the empty ring box. Derek congratulated him for 20 minutes straight, and then immediately started talking about throwing the best bachelor party Columbus had ever seen. Jason laughed and felt like the luckiest man alive. He asked Derek to be his best man. Derek said yes without a moment's hesitation. Neither of them could have known. Or rather, one of them already knew exactly what was happening, and it wasn't Jason. The wedding was held on a Saturday in late September. The weather had cooperated in a way that felt almost personal. Warm, clear, a slight breeze that kept the outdoor ceremony from feeling too hot. The venue was a converted farmhouse about 40 minutes outside of Columbus that Sasha had found online and fallen in love with immediately. It had a stone pathway leading up to the ceremony space, white string lights strung between wooden beams, and a barn that had been renovated into a reception hall with polished concrete floors and long wooden tables. It was beautiful in a way that felt real rather than staged, and Jason, who had been mostly indifferent to the wedding planning details, had to admit when he saw it all come together that Sasha had gotten it exactly right. 83 guests attended. His parents sat in the front row on the left, his mother holding a tissue she had folded into a small square. His two brothers stood beside him at the altar, along with Derek, who wore his tuxedo well and spent the morning making jokes to keep Jason from getting too inside his own head. Jason was nervous in the way most grooms are nervous, the good kind, the kind that means something matters. He stood at the altar and watched the door and waited. And when the music changed and Sasha appeared at the end of the aisle, every bit of his nervousness dissolved into something else entirely. She was stunning. She walked toward him slowly, her eyes holding his from the moment she appeared. And by the time she reached him and took his hand, Jason felt something settle in his chest, a kind of certainty he had never questioned before. The ceremony lasted 32 minutes. The vows were traditional. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the room erupted, and Jason kissed his bride in the middle of the applause and thought, "This is it. This is the beginning." Derek gave a toast at the reception that had the whole room laughing, and then toward the end, surprisingly emotional. He talked about the kind of man Jason was. He talked about loyalty. He talked about how rare it was to find someone who kept every promise they made. He raised his glass and said Jason was the best man he had ever known. The room cheered. Jason stood up and hugged him. Sasha smiled from across the table. And nobody, not one of the 83 guests, not the caterers, not the photographer capturing it all, had any idea what was already in motion. The reception ran until 9 o'clock. They had rented out a block of rooms at a nearby hotel, a modest but clean place about 10 minutes from the venue, for out-of-town guests and the wedding party. The plan was simple. Finish the reception, say goodbye to family, and then Jason and Sasha would spend their wedding night at the hotel before flying out the following afternoon for their honeymoon in Puerto Rico. It was a straightforward, uncomplicated plan, the kind of plan that only goes wrong when someone decides to let it. The goodbyes took longer than expected.
the way they always do at weddings. There were relatives to hug and photos to take and well-wishers who had one more thing to say. By the time Jason and Sasha arrived at the hotel, it was close to 10. They checked in, got their keycards, and agreed that Sasha would head up to the room while Jason stopped to chat briefly with a few out-of-town friends who were gathered in the hotel lobby bar.
His college roommate, Tommy, was telling a story that had everyone laughing, and Jason, still riding the warmth of the evening, stayed for one more drink than he planned. It was maybe 45 minutes later when he finally said his goodbyes and headed toward the elevator. He texted Sasha from the lobby, "On my way up, you asleep?" No response. He assumed she had fallen asleep. It had been an emotional, exhausting day, and Sasha always crashed hard after events. He took the elevator to the 4th floor, turned down the quiet corridor toward their room, and pulled his keycard from his jacket pocket. The hallway was almost entirely silent, just the low hum of the ice machine at the far end and the muffled sound of a television somewhere behind a closed door. He slid his card into the reader. The light blinked red. He tried again. Red. He must have gotten the cards mixed up. He checked his jacket pockets again and realized he only had one card. Strange. He stood there for a moment, and that's when he heard it. Voices inside the room. Low voices, and what sounded like laughter. He thought maybe the television was on. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, louder this time. The voices inside stopped. There was a long pause, a pause that lasted just a beat too long. The kind of pause that tells you something is being rearranged on the other side of the door. And then Sasha's voice, slightly strained, called out, "Just a second." Jason stood in that hallway and felt something he had no name for yet. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It wasn't even suspicion, exactly. It was more like a wrongness. A low physical wrongness. The way you feel when a step on a staircase isn't where you expected it to be. He stood very still and waited.
Before we go further, if you enjoy real stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next video. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you were standing in that hallway right now? What would you do if that pause told you everything you didn't want to know? Let me know below. Now, let's continue. The door opened. Sasha stood there in the hotel robe, her hair down, her eyes doing something Jason had never seen them do before. Darting, calculating, searching for something to land on that wasn't his face. "Hey," she said. Just, "hey," like he was a neighbor stopping by to return a borrowed tool. Jason looked past her into the room. The bedside lamp was on. Both sides of the bed had been disturbed. There was a second pair of shoes near the closet. Men's shoes. He recognized them immediately. He had seen those shoes 100 times. He had been in enough photos standing next to those shoes to know their worn left heel, their scuffed toe, the particular way their laces were always double knotted. His whole body went cold. "Who's here?" he asked. His voice came out quiet, which surprised him. He had expected to yell. Instead, he just stood there, very still, very quiet, the way you get when your body hasn't caught up to what your mind already knows. Sasha opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Jason, He walked past her into the room, and there, standing near the bathroom doorway, with his jacket in his hand and no expression on his face, was Derek Lawson, his best man, his college roommate. The man who had just stood in front of 83 people and toasted Jason's loyalty. The man who had held Jason's wedding rings at the altar and handed them over at exactly the right moment. The man Jason had called from the parking lot 10 years ago when he got his first real job offer. The man who had been in Jason's corner for almost his entire adult life. The three of them stood in that hotel room in a silence that felt absolute. Jason looked at Derek for a long time. He looked at the bed. He looked at Sasha. He looked back at Derek. And then he said the only thing he could think of, which was, "Get out." Just that. Get out. Derek said his name, said it in a way that suggested he was about to try to explain something which was almost impressive under the circumstances. And Jason said it again, quieter this time. And something in the quietness of it made Derek pick up his shoes without another word and walk out of the room.
Jason stood in the doorway and watched him go. He heard the elevator doors open and close. He heard the hallway go silent again. And then he turned around and lifted his wife of 6 hours, standing in a robe in the room they were supposed to spend their wedding night in, and he waited for her to say something that made sense. She didn't. She said his name. She said she was sorry. She said she could explain. She said it was a mistake. She said she didn't know how it happened. And Jason stood in the doorway of that hotel room in his wedding suit with a boutonniere still pinned to his lapel and listened to every word his wife said, and not one of those words explained anything at all.
Can you imagine what it must feel like to stand in that room, to have the entire architecture of the day you've been building toward for 2 years collapse in a single moment, to look at the person you just vowed your life to and realize that at some level they had been performing a version of love rather than living it? Stop for a moment and ask yourself honestly, how would you have held yourself together? Or would you? Because Jason, by every account from those who knew him, was not a man who fell apart easily. But that night, in that room, he came close. What came out over the next hour was worse than the moment of discovery, because Sasha, perhaps believing that the only way through was honesty, began to confess, not just to a single terrible decision made in the blur of an emotional evening. She and Derek had been involved for over 4 months. It had started, she said, the previous spring, when the two of them had been left to handle some last-minute wedding venue coordination while Jason was traveling for work.
It had happened gradually, she said, which is the thing people say when they want to describe something that was actually a series of deliberate choices. There had been phone calls, late nights, conversations she had told Jason were work obligations, the secretive phone calls, the distant weekends. Every small flag he had dismissed, every moment he had talked himself out of his own instinct, now had a context he couldn't unknow. Derek had known the wedding was happening. He had stood at that altar. He had given that speech about loyalty. He had handed over the rings. He had looked Jason in the eye all day and said nothing. And Sasha had walked down that aisle, knowing that the man standing up at the front of the church as her husband's best friend was the same man she had been deceiving that husband with for 4 months.
This was not an impulsive mistake made in the heat of a single terrible moment. This was a choice made over and over again by two people Jason had trusted completely. And here's the question that will sit with you long after this video ends. How do you recover from something like that? Not just the betrayal, but the rewriting. The way every memory between that night and the beginning of the affair suddenly looks different. Every dinner, every phone call, every "I love you" said while Sasha was also living another version of events entirely. How do you reconcile the person you believed you knew with the person sitting across from you in a hotel room, explaining themselves, while your wedding flowers are still fresh on the nightstand? Jason did not yell. Those who knew him well would not have been surprised. Instead, he asked questions, carefully, methodically, in the same steady way he had lived his whole life. He asked when it started. He asked how often. He asked if anyone else had known. Sasha answered everything, and each answer was its own small devastation. She said she had been trying to end it. She said she thought getting married would make it stop. She said she loved Jason, and she said it like she believed it, which in some ways made it harder to hear, not easier, because what she was describing was a version of love that had coexisted comfortably with deception, and Jason had no framework for that. Love to him had always been simple. You showed up, you were honest, you kept your promises. That was the whole of it. He tried to reach Derek by phone. No answer. He wasn't surprised. He sat on the edge of the bed in that hotel room and looked at the floor for a long time. At some point, Sasha sat down beside him, and he stood up and moved to the chair by the window. Not because he wanted to be cruel, but because he genuinely did not know what to do with her nearness. Outside, the parking lot was quiet. A car moved slowly through the lot and disappeared. A light went off in a window across the courtyard. The world, as it tends to do, was proceeding without regard for what had just happened inside room 412. He called his brother, Nathan, at nearly midnight. Nathan answered on the third ring, heard Jason's voice, and said, "I'm on my way." He didn't ask for details. He just came. That's the kind of person Nathan was. He sat with Jason in the hotel lobby for 2 hours while Jason went through everything. The voices, the shoes, the confession, the 4 months, all of it. Nathan didn't say much. He handed Jason a coffee from the lobby machine and let him talk. At one point, Nathan said, very quietly, "I'm sorry, man." And Jason nodded and stared at the floor, and that was about as much as either of them needed to say. Jason did not get on that plane to Puerto Rico. He and Nathan drove back to Columbus the next morning in near silence. The honeymoon was canceled. The marriage, which was barely 12 hours old, was over in everything but paperwork. Jason moved in with Nathan for 3 weeks while he figured out his next step. He filed for an annulment the following month. The attorney he hired told him that given the circumstances and the brevity of the marriage, the process would be relatively straightforward. It was, in the legal sense, the easiest part of all of it.
Derek never called. Not that day, not that week, not in the weeks that followed. He had simply gone silent. The silence of someone who understands there is nothing to say that would not make things worse. Their mutual friends, most of whom had been at the wedding, were left in the strange position of knowing what had happened while trying to figure out which side of it they were standing on. Some of them reached out to Jason. Some didn't. One of them, a friend Jason had known since high school, sent a single text that said, "I don't have words. I'm here if you need me." Jason saved that text for a long time. He wasn't sure why. He said later that it was just nice to have confirmation that some people, when it mattered, said exactly the right amount. Sasha reached out twice in the weeks following. The first time was a long message that Jason read once and did not respond to. The second time was shorter. She said she was sorry, that she knew nothing she said could change what had happened, and that she hoped he was okay. He read that one twice. He didn't respond to that one either. He told Nathan later that he believed she meant it, that she was genuinely sorry. But he had learned, somewhere in the long quiet of those weeks, that being sorry and being trustworthy were two entirely different things, and that one did not automatically become the other just because the person felt bad. The months that followed were not cinematic in the way pain is sometimes depicted. There was no single breakdown, no dramatic moment of catharsis, just the slow, unglamorous work of processing a grief that didn't fit neatly into any category, because it was the loss of a marriage, yes, but it was also the loss of a friendship, and the loss of a future he had already begun to build in his imagination. He continued going to work. He picked up running again, something he had let slide during the wedding planning. He started cooking more. He talked to a therapist for about 4 months, which he told almost nobody about, but would later describe as one of the better decisions he made that year.
Here is what Jason Cooper's story teaches us, if we are willing to sit with it honestly. It teaches us that betrayal is almost never delivered by a stranger. It arrives wearing a familiar face. It knows your habits and your routines and the sound of your voice when you're happy. It knows exactly how to look you in the eye. It teaches us that the people who speak most eloquently about loyalty are not always the people who practice it. And it teaches us that the instincts we talk ourselves out of, the ones we dismiss because we would rather believe the comfortable explanation, those instincts are sometimes trying to tell us something important, something we are not yet ready to hear. But here is the other thing Jason's story teaches us, the one that is perhaps harder to talk about, but more important. He did not become bitter. That's the word people used when they described him a year later. Not broken, not angry, just changed, the way anyone changes after they have survived something that cost them more than they expected to pay. He started over. He kept working. He kept showing up. He remained the kind of person who called his mother on Sunday evenings and remembered his co-workers' birthdays and held the door open for people behind him. The betrayal did not make him cruel, and it did not make him closed. It made him, if anything, more deliberate, more careful about who he let into his inner circle, more attentive to what people did rather than what they said, and more certain in the quiet knowledge that only comes from having been through something real,
that his own integrity, the thing that had been taken advantage of, was still entirely his own. No one had taken that. No one could. So let me ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly before you scroll past. If that had been you, if you had stood in that hotel hallway on your wedding night, felt that pause on the other side of the door, and opened it to find the two people you trusted most in the world, what would you have done? How would you have held yourself together? How long would it have taken you to start over? And do you think there is anyone in your life right now, not necessarily romantic, maybe just someone you trust deeply, who you might be giving more faith to than their actions have actually earned? I'm not asking you to be suspicious. I'm asking you to be awake.
Because Jason was a good man. He was loyal and honest and steady, and none of that protected him. The only thing that protected him, in the end, was his decision to keep being those things anyway, even after someone else proved they couldn't do the same. What do you think Jason should have done in that moment? What would you have done? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story moved you or made you think, or made you want to call someone you love and just check in, then please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to like this video, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Because every week, we bring you real stories about real people. Stories about trust, loss, betrayal, and the extraordinary capacity human beings have for starting over. We'll see you in the next one.